Now we're live again. Cool. Round 2. Okay. Welcome everybody. This is the first round of the Casual Catz Chess Championship, featuring 16 of our best and brightest chess players from around the server. I'll be your host tonight. I'm John, and my co-host is Michael Olger. Say hi.
Wow.
Now, Michael, how much do you know about chess?
Well, I once used a chessboard as a makeshift charcuterie board, so that's kind of the extent.
Perfect. He'll fit right in. So game 1, a really interesting game between Cayla and Joel. Now, for those of you who don't know, Cayla and Joel are actually currently in a relationship. Uh, so
Oh.
this all of the matchups that I made the bracket. Um, I had no way of seeding these players. Like we don't have like past tournament experience to go off of to like seed them fairly. And so I just had to like talk to them and get a sense for what would be fun and like put people in like interesting matchups, and the people who I didn't have any idea, I like sort of put them together as like wild cards. Anyway, this game was game number 1. The format, by the way, are best of 5s, and the time control is 3 minutes uh, and 2 seconds per move for each player. And so Joel started off with the white pieces moving this pawn to g3. Um, an interesting start to the game, to be sure. Cayla then immediately responded with this move, uh, developing the pawn in front of the bishop. So far, Cayla is fighting for the center, which is like the main idea in the early stages of chess. You want to like develop your pieces and like try to control these center squares as much as possible. And for the rest of these casts, it's worth noting that when I refer to like how much space you control, basically this side and down is white space, and this side and down is black space. So when I talk about space, we're talking about like how many squares you might control on your opponent's side. And so in this case, Cayla's with this pawn is attacking these 2 squares on white side, and is also contesting one of the central 4 squares that we talked about. So slightly better move than g3, but we'll see what Joel's ideas are. After this, he developed the bishop, attacking the pawn immediately, which, is a fair move. Cayla then developed her pawn to protect it. So far, literally, Michael, there's literally nothing interesting happening. Like, we're just doing standard. They're just getting their pieces out. Joel puts his knight out. Cayla, moves the pawn. These players are moving really fast. They still have some amount of time on the clock. Joel then pushes his pawn. I think Cayla and Joel are probably about like anywhere between 500 and 800 elo. Like they're uh, you know relative beginners, so it's fun. It's like every game they play is like super exciting. I think you'd probably agree with me, Michael, wouldn't you say that chess can kind of be kind of boring at like even a like an average, or not an average, but like an advanced level, not even an expert level. I think chess can become pretty like slogging, wouldn't you say?
I would use the word stagnating and dumb.
Exactly. But these games are not dumb at all. These games are actually
Yeah,
like
no.
filled with drama. Because you just never know. It doesn't matter how big the advantage is, it's actually just never enough.
Much like my solo queue game.
Exactly. Here, Cayla took a few seconds, which, in these sort of fast games are precious. And she ended up moving this knight to here. And this is the first, like, kind of questionable move. Everything else has been not theory. Like, none of these moves have been theory by any stretch of the imagination. But like already in this position, what's interesting for the people watching is that in this position, uh, has never been reached in this move sequence on the entire chess.com database. So every game ever played on chess.com, this is the first game that ever reached this position in this exact move order. So on move 8, we're already in a novelty. A novelty is a position that hasn't been reached before, which, that's beginner chess for you. The reason I don't love this knight move is that fundamentally the knights sort of have the ability to go in a lot of different angles. You know how they move in the L shape. And so if I click on a knight, you can see the squares that it can go to. And so Joel's knight here controls 5 squares, roughly 4 squares that are relevant. And 2 of those squares are squares that are in the black territory. So this is a well-positioned knight. This knight, on the other hand, controls these 2 squares and this square, which seems fine. But what happens is that it has to move again before it starts contesting the center in the same way this knight does. This knight controls so many squares in the center, at least 3 on their territory, and this knight only controls 1 in white's territory, and only 1 that's even approaching the center. And so in order for this knight to have impact, it would have to move again to say here, and then it would have a large amount of influence comparable to the white knight. So it's just a slow developing move, but we're getting the pieces out. What Joel after this seemed to ponder a bit, and then he pushed this pawn. Any thoughts about the game so far? Or is it just another chess game?
I would put it firmly in the camp of confusing.
Yeah, it's a confusing position for sure.
I would say that I think both players are trying to reach a conclusion.
Yes. So finally we have our first striking move. White is deciding to move the knight a second time, generally frowned upon in most opening theory. You kind of want to move all your minor pieces first before you start moving them a second time, because you're just spending a lot of extra time. But white is actually really ahead in development currently. Black has spent a great deal of time moving their pawns. And the problem when you move these pawns is that you greatly weaken certain squares, and this is one of the squares. By pushing this pawn, black pushing this pawn up, either 1 or 2, what ends up happening is that you dramatically weaken this square, because normally the square would be able to be contested by both this pawn and this pawn. But you remove one of the defenders of this square by pushing this pawn too far forward early on. So you give the opportunity for this knight to hop in. So we'll see what happens from there. A story of this match is that, and a story of both matches that have happened so far actually, is that the players tend to struggle with low time controls, which makes sense because the only way to really play fast chess effectively is to be fairly experienced in chess and kind of know the openings and moves you want to go. You don't have time to think very much, which is obviously a drawback for people who probably would benefit a great deal from being able to think about their moves. So the knight gets attacked. Joel moves his knight away, and this is actually a catastrophic blunder, because following bishop taking on e6, the bishop can just take the knight now, which then is only 1 piece, but it actually, because of the position of black's pieces, puts white at a catastrophic disadvantage if the bishop could take this knight. It's just a hanging piece. And a recurring theme in these games is these players not noticing or seeing just immediate threats. Many times you'll see that there's immediate attacks on the queen, or potentially checkmating patterns on the king that are just missed frequently in a lot of these games, which will come up. But right now this knight logically moves out of the attack of the bishop and starts going for this queen, but misses the fact that it's just completely lost without a defender. But we'll see if Cayla notices it. She doesn't. She moves her queen up to attack the knight, potentially. later on in this match, you'll see that the narrative of this is that Joel moves his knight away. One of the main narratives of this match was Cayla's transformation as a player, which for those watching who were there will know what I'm talking about. But those who weren't there, stay tuned. Get this queen push, and then the pawn attacking it immediately. Then, in a ridiculous turn of events, after this pawn push attacking this queen, Cayla calmly develops her bishop, believe it or not, and immediately hangs her queen to the pawn. So that's kind of the situation we're in. Michael, you can't even imagine like what was going through my head when I saw that move.
It's probably the same thing that goes through my head when I see like 12-year-olds at cheese buffets, which is just, this is going to go terribly wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the game goes on for a bit longer. Cayla obviously took some time thinking about her next move, how to best recover from this position. She tries to get her knight out of danger, recognizing that pawns can in fact take diagonally. And she is actually putting pressure on the white queen, which is worth mentioning. Joel promptly notices and moved it out of the way. Now, as far as Black's chances in this game, it's gone basically to 0. You'll notice that now, depending on what Black does, like this bishop is hanging to the knight. There's a lot of stuff that White can do. White can still castle. Can get this bishop out on the long diagonal, attacking the rook potentially. This queen can actually just take the rook. The rook is also just hanging to the queen on White's next move. So Black really has to move very carefully in this position, which is like super dangerous. Defending both this and this from their respective attackers is like a mighty task, to say the least. But Black decides to infiltrate with the knight and give a check. Any thoughts about this move?
I think on the surface it looks good. I would say that this game has gotten farther than most chess games I have played.
Joel, recognizing that this knight isn't defended, just calmly takes back with the queen. Continues to put Black in an even deeper deficit. And this game goes on a few more moves. We can just go through them as quickly as the players did. It really is just the story of White consolidating their advantage and Black struggling to find any sort of counterplay at all, which is just like at this stage relatively unfeasible. At this stage, Cayla's also about 30 seconds down on the clock, so also struggling for time. But oh man, although this game is petering out, just wait. You have no idea what's in store for you.
I definitely don't.
Continuing to just blunder pieces. Starting to pick up the pace a little bit. Not going to spend too much time analyzing this position from here because this is a clever attack, though. This tactic where the bishop can take the pawn. Obviously, if the queen takes back, the rook will take the queen, which will be bishop for a queen, which will definitely give Black chances again. Joel doesn't accept the trade, though, unfortunately. It's worth noting that Joel played fairly solid for most of this match, honestly. Cayla going for some exchange now. Trading pieces is never really good when you're behind fundamentally because, it's like like if you have, 10 oranges, right? And I have 5 apples and, I get, I can give you an apple for every orange that you have. What'll happen is you'll have 5 oranges and 5 apples, and I'll have 5 oranges. You know what I mean? There's a check here.
I don't eat fruit, so I'm a little confused.
Oh, well. Basically, trading when you're behind is a quick way to run out of pieces,
Hmm.
and your opponent will have pieces left. Because if they're up a knight and then you trade everything else equally, like every pawn for every pawn and every rook for every rook, they'll end up with a knight and you'll have nothing because they were up a knight. But interestingly enough, white is kind of struggling to convert on their advantage in this position, in spite of the fact that they do finally realize that the knight was hanging. Also, there's a distinct lack of castling in these positions, which I always find to be pretty interesting. Getting these bishops on the edge is not the worst idea. The rook is hanging though, so obviously the rook gets captured. Very unfortunate. Cayla's maintaining about a 30-second disadvantage in this game. We're just still making moves. Black's advancing on the board, trying to do something with these pawns, but there's a very clean mating sequence here. These sequence of captures effectively. White now finally comes to collect and starts gobbling up all the pawns on the right side of the board. There's plenty of ways for white to win now, but the game goes on. And one of the options is you can obviously just march this pawn down the side of the board and promote into a queen. Other interesting ideas I can see are like there's some sequences of checks that you can give. You can start getting these rooks into the game. You want to develop your knight again. Undeveloping the knight was an interesting choice. Now there's this check, and now the king is sort of having to kind of walk back into the center of the board, which is really scary. You never want your king to be this far forward when there's this many pieces left on the board. The king has marched all the way up the board to a white side. Now there's just a very simple mate in one. It's just actually there's several mate in ones. One of them is just calmly queen c2 is mate. Queen c3 is mate because the king has nowhere to go, completely cut off by the rook and the bishop, and the queen is protected by the pawn, both attacking the king and taking all his squares away. Whether here or here, either of these queen moves are mate. There's also a very interesting mate in this position. You do bishop f1. This little cute bishop move actually hits the king, and because the king is covering and the knight is covering the square, and the rook covers this file and the bishop covers this file, the king is actually mated with a clean bishop move. But I don't think the players saw that move. I don't think Joel saw that move. He continues to put the king in check. Cayla has some moves left. Joel is doing a good thing in continuing to check the king, because you don't want to ever stalemate your opponent by giving it so they have no legal moves left. So the simplest way to not stalemate is by just continuously putting the king in check. Unfortunately, he does hang the pawn here, which is a little awkward. But continuing to put pressure on the king. And Joel finds the mate. It's a good one. The king can't obviously take the knight because it's protected by the queen, and it would also not get him out of check. This is actually attacked by the knight. These squares are attacked by the queen, and this square is defended by the pawn. So Joel, with a series of checks, finds one of the many possible mates and summarily dismisses game one. Okay, so game two. Cayla now has the white pieces. So let's see what she has going on. starts off with G3. Black goes knight C6. Cayla develops her knight. This is looking awfully similar to Joel's opening as white in the previous game. I think almost the exact same move order. I think obviously these two are a couple, and I think they play each other probably semi-regularly, so I think they have like a opening repertoire that might be less common to the average viewer. So far, so good. This opening of the file here. In this position, with that sort of pawn exchange here, it would be very easy to just drop your rook in the game, but the problem is that it's defended by the knight, so it's a little awkward. The plan was sort of to open up the file over here has been temporarily halted. But Cayla continues to press. Joel finds this nice queen developing move attacking both this pawn and the knight. Cayla goes all the way for the infiltration with the bishop and puts Joel in a position where he can't castle anymore. But although Joel losing his ability to castle is not a huge detriment, considering that Cayla's now down a pawn and a bishop.
You know, one time I played chess against my 9-year-old niece, and she was very confused when I castled, and she told me that that was illegal, and then she didn't want to play anymore.
Honestly, castling seems a little illegal to a lot of these players, but that's okay. This is the casual Corona Cast chess tournament. Emphasis on casual.
They think I could have a shot, huh?
Basically.
I've heard there's pretty sweet prizes.
There are pretty sweet prizes.
I can save a lot on shipping, too.
For those of you who might not know, who are watching, this tournament is fully funded prize support. There's also custom 3D printed trophies going out to our lovely players who can get first and second. And then there's a super special surprise for people who make it into the second round. Anyway, play continues. With this bishop move, Cayla blunders the rook, and honestly, I think like the most instructive thing about a lot of these games that get played is it's just really a sequence of unfortunate events where at this level of chess, I think, in my experience, it just comes down to like who blunders less, because both players at this level are gonna blunder like constantly. And so you really just want to like the best way to, for those who are watching who want to improve at chess, like I think the first and easiest way is just try to look to see if your pieces that you're moving are or just pieces on the board, even if you're not moving them somewhere, are immediately under attack by one of your opponent's pieces and not defended by another piece. So like looking to see if your pieces are defended and if they're immediately under attack by something. I think that's like, for me, that has been like the most instructional thing that I've seen from all these games. Is people just, missing pieces that are just like this knight, for example. The bishop does have to take back, and so it's a little bit awkward at this point, but obviously this knight is hanging. And now Cayla finds herself in a position about a minute down on the clock, and struggling to defend these pieces. She's down a lot of material. She's down to only a queen, a rook, and a bishop, and some pawns. Joel is up a pawn, and a knight, a bishop, and a rook. So
in my experience, you can get a lot done at just a minute.
That's true. The time is 2 minutes and 50 seconds for Joel and 2 minutes for Cayla. Now this is a great move from Black. This is this centralizing rook move. You love to see rooks on these big open files where they can just like charge down the board on a moment's notice, and they control so many squares. Like we talked about, like how controlling squares in the center is really important, and controlling squares on your opponent's side of the board is really important. This rook controls 4, which is just really powerful. And then it sets up eventually to be able to potentially infiltrate. Like if you get rid of this bishop, the rook could potentially infiltrate and then control, potentially like 7+ squares on your opponent's side of the board. Just getting these rooks on open files, really solid fundamental developing strategy in these sort of mid to late games. And this is what I'm talking about. So this casual bishop b4 by Cayla, just obviously missing that it's under attack by 2 pieces and also not defended by the queen anymore. And Joel comes to collect, and this is the move that we were talking about. This is like the ideal position for the rook in this current position. It controls all these squares. It doubles up with the queen. It's just it's a real problem right now. Lots of some tactics can be coming in. Like if this rook is ever able to get to here, like let's say the queen drops down here, and then the rook drops down here, you can pin the queen to the king and pick up the queen very easily, because the queen won't be able to move because you can't move your king into check. So this is obviously just like a completely winning position for black, and normally I would probably just move on to the next game, but for the sake of the players who played the game, I feel like I have to honor their performance by showing the whole game. There's still some exciting twists. Michael,
I literally cannot imagine them.
Michael, I'm telling you, you're gonna lose your mind when you see some of the shit that happens in this game. It is actually so funny.
I think the most exciting thing for me about chess is that the games do have an ending.
What game doesn't have an ending? D&D?
It feels like League of Legends doesn't, because you're always stuck in the hell.
This infinite time loop.
Yes.
So this actually, what's interesting, not to cut you off, is that this sequence of moves that has been developed for black in this position, like this quick sequence of getting this bishop on this long diagonal, is obviously insanely strong. Like obviously really, really good position for the bishop. And then, this normal knight development move, this is like what's called a fianchetto, where you get this bishop in this little pawn triangle here. And I think black is still able to castle. So castling in this position is just like crushing. Would be absolutely crushing if we got to see it. Now, what I would do is I would just take this pawn and then offer the exchange of queens, because when you're ahead on material, you're perfectly happy just trading down into a winning endgame. But it is a bit dangerous to do that when you're a lower rated player, because if you don't have experience playing like very open positions with just a few pieces left and knowing like your king pawn and king rook endgames, you can find yourself either stalemating or in a losing position kind of out of nowhere if you don't have your queen. And so I wouldn't advise trading your queen, even if you're really, really ahead. It's just a little bit too risky. So Joel takes my advice and takes with the bishop, which temporarily disconnects the queen from the rook, but neither of them are under attack, so it's okay. Cayla pushes the pawn. Joel calmly hangs the bishop. But it actually is not quite lost yet, because this came with check. This queen move came with check, so potentially buys a time for the bishop to move out of the way. We'll see if he notices. He does. Again, like I said, I think just throughout this match, Joel played just like fairly solid. Honestly, pretty impressive. I think though Cayla very early on found herself in like pretty catastrophic deficits and tried to play out of them for a lot of moves and just kind of like struggled to find counterplay. And that's the thing with chess, right? It's like once you're behind, it's really hard to come back. Like I was playing a game against M the other day, and I'm like, I'm definitely at least 900 to 1,000 elo above her, and I just completely hung my queen in a very short time control of bullet game, which is like a minute for each player. I did not even see that my queen was under attack. I was like completely looking at a totally different idea on the board, and it was like the first time I blundered my queen in like 150 games, and she like came to collect, dude. Like the skill discrepancy meant nothing. Like she very calmly closed out the game after I hung my queen. It's just like it's so hard to come back if you blunder really badly. Which some people like, some people don't like. I think um it makes chess kind of feel like a bar fight. You know what I mean? It feels like very like volatile at all states of the game, which I really like a lot. Uh, Interestingly enough, after this pawn move in this position, Cayla promptly moved her queen, checking the king and hanging it to the rook, uh, which is basically a call for resignation. But as a good sport, she continued to play on. She did get this interesting structure out of Joel, getting him to triple his pawns. Uh, Doubled pawns are generally considered quite bad, and triple pawns are obviously terrible. They get in each other's way, prevent each other from moving, and they also don't defend each other. So just like nice little Christmas tree of weakness. But this pawn does defend the rook at least, which is something. At this point, I personally would just resign, but there's always a chance. There's always a chance that your opponent stalemates you. There's always a chance that they start making catastrophic blunders, or you find some kind of a ridiculous last shot back rank make position where it's never too late for your opponent to throw in a game of chess. So um, also not too unlike League.
Yes, I've noticed that. League also feels like a bar fight in that you're constantly getting your head smashed in.
um, exactly. This again now is just like the slow dismissal of the position, trying to find a nice quick end. And there's just a wonderful mate here. Queen takes the pawn on f3, which is just mate. And Joel has gone up 2-0 in the match. So Cayla has to dig deep and fight back. And this really, Michael, this was where when I was first watching these games, I was fairly certain that that we were done. You know what I mean? I was pretty sure after watching those two games and Joel getting to just a pretty catastrophic advantage, um, in the first like 10 moves. I was fairly sure that this was gonna be a done and dusted series. But oh boy, was I wrong. um, we are in game 3 now. Cayla with the black pieces for the second time, and we're starting to get a sense for Joel's opening repertoire. He is really favoring these uh, flank pawn fianchetto sort of queenside developing moves as white. He was doing this before on kingside, so a slight change of pace. And out of nowhere, Cayla finally decides to play serious proper chess. These opening, this queen's pawn opening with the knight to follow it up. This is just as standard as it can get. This knight controls the center square with the pawn. The pawn is also controlling another square on their side of the board. It's defended by both the knight and the queen. This is just good coordination of pieces, and you'll see very quickly that it was the most give the controller to your big brother moment I've ever seen. Like Cayla literally like evolved as a player in this game, and it became quite an exciting series. But I'm not going to spoil anything. Casual development. Something I've noticed from Joel in these games is that he sort of not passively develops his pawns, but slowly pushes them out. Gets this nice check on the king, though. Cayla has to figure out what the best way to defend that is. There's a few options. You can obviously block with the bishop, which is what she does. You could have also blocked with the pawn, set up sort of a reverse London structure, which with pawns would have been interesting. Bishop just moves back, getting another bishop out. Now these are just like, again, this position for black is night and day compared to any position Cayla has gotten in the last 2 games. Like, these bishops are both developed. They see so many different squares potentially. The king can castle now. The knight is on a nice central square. This pawn is on a nice square defended by another pawn. Prepping this knight to get out. It's just such a good position for black. It was very, very, very good to see a nice change of pace. Joel ends up going for this exchange. Cayla calmly takes back. And Joel actually makes an uncharacteristic blunder, moving this knight out. He actually hangs it to the queen, which would have been quite good had Cayla noticed it. I think she's thinking about it, and she spots it. She takes the hanging knight. Incredible. Joel's bishop comes down looking for compensation. This bishop can just honestly take it. It's hanging. This bishop is completely hanging. It's not defended by anything. Cayla sees it. And you can see now, look, out of nowhere, Cayla has like an absolutely commanding advantage. Moves her bishop back. Can continue to capture the center. It honestly, Michael, honestly, it's like it's a different player, honestly. What are your thoughts?
It does seem like moves are being made. And it does seem like they are being effective in whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish.
Michael Oliger, everybody, he'll be here all night. Then Cayla moves this knight in here, checks the king, hangs it to the queen. Bit of an awkward tempo play. However, she's so far ahead in material that it doesn't actually matter that much. Breaking up white's pawn structure like this is actually like pretty effective. Although albeit not necessarily worth the sacrifice. Now she develops her knight. Again, an interesting theme is these players seem kind of allergic to castling.
Do you think they're aware that they can?
It does beg the question. It does beg the question for sure. This is a good knight move. Continue to be defended by this pawn, and with this infiltration comes just like absolutely tons of power. He does miss that this knight is hanging, which is an interesting sequence of moves following this capture. And black is sort of slowly but surely bleeding out their advantage in exchange for minor compensation with pawns, but the result has opened up white's position dramatically. White's position is in absolute shambles, and in spite of almost equalizing on material now, you'll see that there's one minor piece each, 2 rooks each, and the queens respectively. So as far as minor and major pieces go, we're even. White's position is in shambles. They're down to only 4 pawns. Black is up 3 pawns, and these 2 pawns are completely isolated on the edges of the board, which in some endgames can be a really huge asset, but in a position like this is actually a huge detriment because they don't defend each other, and they're long-term weaknesses that need to be defended by other pieces like the rook or the queen. Just having to commit those pieces to defending these pawns that are really hard to protect otherwise in what is otherwise a really open position. is quite challenging indeed. This nice queen move with check. And again, like I said, like these games seem to be just like decided like by by your ability to close out games. And so another piece of advice for you aspiring chess players out there is brush up on those really basic end games. You know, like just take the time to kind of figure out what you're supposed to be doing when there's so few pieces on the board, and like some basic mating strategies, like how to like checkmate the king with like a rook and a queen, for example. This check is actually catastrophic because it hangs the rook to the knight, but Joel doesn't see it. Cayla gets another check over here, and the king is promptly and summarily running out of moves. And I'm pretty sure the only legal move is rook b2 to defend the king from check, because the king can't move up and can't stay where he is because he's in check. And so the only way to get him out of check is to move the rook. You're forced to move the rook in front of the king. And then the queen can take the rook, and it's just a very clean, smothered mate in the corner. So the rook moves, and the queen captures with a decisive mate, and Cayla wins game 3.
Wow.
It's just like night and day, honestly. Really just incredible. Cayla gained like anywhere from 300 to 400 elo in a single game. It was pretty incredible, honestly. But you know, we go to game 4. Cayla has the white pieces again.
You know, I really vibed with something you said in that last game, which was researching mating strategies. That's something I do almost every night.
Don't tell your girlfriend that.
Usually while she's asleep.
The importance of a 2-room apartment. Anyway, so now with the white pieces, once again, Cayla sort of returns to her old strategies, and you get to see again that I think it's pretty fairly obvious that Cayla and Joel play each other semi-regularly, at least enough where they have sort of a standardized repertoire of openings. Joel really likes to go for these wing knight moves that I sort of talked about. Joel, if you're watching, I would probably look to not do this and do this instead with your knight, because the weakness of this, like I said earlier in the cast, is that you're controlling less squares effectively than if you are on this square with your knight, where you then control a whole lot more squares. Plus 2 in their territory and 1 in the center, 2 in the center actually. This is just a slightly worse move than this for the knight when you go for this structure. Anyway, Cayla goes for this sort of 4 knights opening. One thing I will say is that although Joel has been fairly consistent with his openings, Cayla has definitely varied up. Has changed up her opening prep for the games, which has been refreshing, because the last thing you want to see is like the same game being played 3 times in a row to a loss each time from both sides.
That is like my solo queue games.
So look at this. This is actually a really instructful moment. Stockfish, for those of you who don't know, the most powerful chess engine in the world, evaluates this position as +3 for white. And the way you can think about it is that it would be minus for black. So if black was in the same level of advantage, it would be -3. Anyway, and you'll notice that no pieces have left the board. That all of the pawns, all the minor pieces, everything, no one has lost a piece yet. And the way that Stockfish calculates advantage is based primarily on the conception of material. And so, like, a pawn is 1 point, bishops and a knight are worth 3, a rook is worth 5, queen is worth 9, generally. And so that's like the way you can generally calculate the relative value of an advantage. So a -9 advantage for black would be the equivalent of being up a queen, would be like after white lost their queen. Anyway, In this position, although no material has been lost or exchanged by either player, Stockfish says that this position is +3 for white. So because of the position of white's knights and strength of its center connected pawns, just the overall flexibility of the position, both of these bishop diagonals are open, right? These pawns are defended both by like the queen and the knights respectively. The bishops have these huge open diagonals. White's position is just incredible here. And black has, like I said, both times with both knights weakened them substantially by putting them on the side of the board. You really don't want to see knights controlling so few squares when they could potentially control up to 8 squares. Only controlling 2 is dramatically weakening as compared to the white knights who control so many squares theoretically, right? They control, like, hypothetically, a load of squares. It's like an octopus with how many squares these knights control. And so because of just the position of the white pieces, Stockfish values this as being like as if black was down a whole knight, like down an entire minor piece, which is really interesting to think that you can be losing based strictly on position alone rather than actual like material advantage. Anyway, enough of that rambling. More chess gets played. This little sequence was an interesting way to give up a little bit of advantage, moving the knight, forcing the pawn break, and then moving the knight back. Joel is marching his pieces down the board. And for those of you wondering why we don't get Joel's perspective, we only have the perspective of Cayla, because she was the one whose stream I was watching while the games were being played. This little pawn break in the center is pretty normal in sort of closed positions like this. The bishop is still under attack. So something needs to be done about that. Cayla still has a big center though, so black needs to be careful, making sure that we don't hang this knight by accidentally moving the bishop away or something.
You know, if there's one thing I've learned from all my years of relationships, it's that you should never tell a girl she has a big center.
Words to live by, honestly. Your center of gravity is low to the ground. More chess gets played. Fair few exchanges on the side of the board. Netting white actually a +1 advantage for in pawn exchanges. This rook going to the center file sort of opens up this pawn and starts starting to cause a lot of problems. Joel's black rook goes for the attack on the knight. Cayla moves it out of the way. Joel continues to harass this knight. There's actually a very funny sequence here. It's fair to say that bishop to g6 with check is actually a really complicated idea, because if you look at where the king can actually move, right, he can only move to these 2 squares. And so let's say he moves to f8, right? So like bishop here, check, king moves to f8, right? And then knight can go to h7 and hit him with check again. And it starts to get out of control really fast, and black starts losing material after a few sequences. So like it's best to, like, in these sort of positions, always look for checks. Wow, Joel actually finds them. Cayla actually finds the best move in the position. Very surprising. Now this rook can just take. The rook is just hanging on the side of the board. We'll see if she notices. Oh, she moves her queen, and just like that, That's what I'm saying. The difference between these two moves, Michael, the difference between this rook move taking this other rook, because you'd say, well, the knight can just take back. Well, the knight actually can't because it's pinned to the king by the bishop. So if this rook takes this rook, the king is in real trouble, and this bishop has to take back. And then the bishop can take the knight because the knight is defending the bishop, and you're just like losing pieces in the game pretty dramatically. But instead, the rook, that's not what happened, right? The knight moves back, and then after this idea, instead of taking with the rook, the queen, she moves the queen up one, and with this very simple queen move, now it gets out of hand so quickly because the queen is actually just hanging to the knight. If you see that with this queen move, the knight can just take the queen and check the king and fork the bishop at the same time. And suddenly you lose your strong dark squared bishop that's defending your knight against this bishop. You lose your queen, and your king is in check and loses the ability to castle. So with one simple move, instead of taking the rook and going into like sort of an exchange over here where you're going to be up material, moving this queen instantly loses the game, like on the spot. And that's sometimes how volatile chess is. But the other thing about chess is just because you make an absolutely catastrophic move does not necessarily mean your opponent punishes you for it. Joel promptly moves to g8 and is once again completely winning for white. So this game ping pongs back and forth like that a lot with both of them missing moves. Now you'd think that that Cayla would recognize that her queen is under attack directly from the knight. Spoilers, she does not. She moves her bishop. And at some point, you have to believe that Joel's going to see this, right?
You would hope.
I don't remember what actually happens in the game. Once actually, Joel again doesn't see it and pushes this pawn.
Do you think that Joel thinks that if he takes it, he loses the to the pawn?
He will, right? He can check the king, and the pawn will take back, but he is trading his knight for the queen.
Which is worth it, but do you think that's what's keeping him from doing it?
It's possible, definitely, but he hasn't shown much hesitancy in trading pieces in the past, so it's more than likely he just doesn't consider the knight move. But maybe he's hesitant. That's an interesting point for sure. Cayla finally starts going for this infiltration with the rook that we wanted to see. Which is solid. Joel lines up a different attack on the queen. He's continuing to not notice that it's hanging in the current position. And what's funny is about this bishop move is that it actually prompts this capture with the bishop because this bishop is now defended by both the rook and the knight, and so the king can't take back. And so Cayla is just capitalizing on the fact that Joel is giving her this space to start bullying his king. The only possible move really is to move it away. And now the rook is hanging too to the bishop, and so Cayla just comes to collect. And out of nowhere, Black's potential advantage is just faded into nothing, and now White is like soundly winning. But finally, Joel sees it and picks up the queen with the bishop that he set up the attack with, and he had no issue trading the bishop. So I think he just didn't notice that the knight could move that way. I think he had it in his mind that the knight moves like this without realizing that the knight can also move like this.
Yeah.
If anything. But now, Stockfish says the game is completely even. And what's absolutely incredible here is that Joel, with his super laser focus on these possible knight moves, finds an absolutely devastating idea. Michael, you'll see that after this, move with the rook, sorry, the knight, you attack the king and the rook at the same time with check. And so no matter where the king potentially moves, you're gonna pick up the rook, which is a devastating tactic called a fork. So the king moves. Now Joel somehow remembering that the knight can in fact move 2 to the left or right, and then also down 1, does collect the rook this time, demonstrating that he does know how the knight actually moves. Continuing to add to the mystery of the queen hanging for 4 moves in a row. I'm telling you, man, these games are not boring. You get the knight move, capturing the hanging pawn. These double pawns, like I said earlier, are definitely not ideal. Queen moves out of the potential pin and starts attacking the bishop. Cayla has to figure out where to move this bishop. Ends up moving it out here, continuing to put pressure on the king. The king can't move anymore, which is interesting because it's cut off by the bishop and the knight. So if she was only able to deliver a check with the king to something, maybe this bishop move afterwards could check the king and take away all of his possible escape plans, and I think just get the checkmate in one. Black's struggling in this position for sure. It definitely is starting to look like Cayla is going to tie the series. Joel makes a desperate attack on the king, checking the king with the queen, but Cayla snaps up the queen with the rook, and is in what is for all intents and purposes an unlosable position. This knight is completely trapped. If it moves either of these squares, it'll get captured by the king or the pawn. So this knight is, for all intents and purposes, captured, which leaves just the rook. And the rook can't even take advantage of the open file because it'll be immediately captured by the bishop. This bishop can start trying to do stuff, but the only real option is taking this pawn that's hanging. And you know, white has several different ways to start threatening mate on different angles, so it's just looking real sus. Black does take the hanging pawn. One of Joel's strengths that I've seen throughout the series so far is that he does identify like weaknesses. Like he was able to find the pawn, and then he's also attacking this pawn. He's looking for some compensation, like reasonably effectively. But there's a neat little mating web here, actually, that's completely forced. You can go knight c3, or sorry, knight c7, I mean, with this move. I think, is that right? Yes, I think if you go knight c7, you're threatening mate because the knight will then cut off this square, and these squares are cut off by the bishop. The knight there will cut off that. This bishop can cut off that square, and now we just need to deliver check to the king. So if knight here to c7, then I think the best move for the bishop is to try to cut off the bishop by going to e5. Then the bishop can take the bishop on e5, and then knight b3 is like an idea, and then just this very calm and collected knight f7 actually is check, because the idea right after this move, let's say black did something like this, right? This knight move to here, right, will not only attack the king, but these squares are cut off by the bishop. This square is attacked by the knight, and you can't capture the knight because the bishop is defending it. So these two very calm knight moves here and then here deliver checkmate, but that's a bit complicated. Probably going to go for a much more simple strategy, which are almost always better.
You mentioned a term a minute ago, a mating something.
Mating net.
That's how I met my girlfriend.
Oh my god. on like a safari.
Yes,
um,
yes.
White. So Cayla then is like, I'll just go for this check, which is normally a really good tactic with the rook. This check sort of skewers the king to the rook, and the king will have to move and can't, right? So this normally, like with this sort of check, attacks the king, and like we've already gone over, is cut off by the bishop and the knight, so it would theoretically be mate. However, unfortunately, this bishop sees the square, and so after rook to b, uh, rook to h8. Actually, sorry, my bad. Um, the only legal move is for the bishop to take, so it's only a matter of time before Joel finds that move. Because obviously you're not allowed on chess.com to make any illegal moves. And he finds it eventually. And now it's important that Cayla just calmly proceeds forward. This position is starting to become stressful. We still have gone over that there's this, uh, mating sequence here that's pretty much forced. Don't say anything inappropriate.
I have no idea who's gonna win. I can honestly say that.
um, it's become a bit more dangerous for Cayla, but she can still definitely close this position out. Um, some other ideas other than going for that checkmate. You can take this pawn and attack the rook and start trying to get more pieces, but then you risk losing this pawn and freeing up your knight somehow, the black knight somehow. Oh, that's what Cayla does. She does take this. Yeah, you wouldn't expect them to see this kind of a complicated knight and bishop mate. It's just very not standard. Joel does not notice that this rook is under attack, and he collects this pawn. And I think Joel still has a minute and a half on his clock, and Cayla's down to 40 seconds. And so there's not a ton of time pressure. Joel could have taken a fair bit of time to see this as a threat, and I think he loses all chance of being able to win the game at all if he loses that rook. But it is up to Cayla to see it. And by clicking on her pieces and finding the possible legal moves, one of the benefits of chess.com, she does see that that is a possible move and captures the rook. And now this is a disaster for black. The checkmate that is involved with just a knight and a bishop is the hardest checkmate in the game. I'm not even very familiar with how to do it myself. I think if you gave me enough time, I would figure it out on a board, but it would take me 50 moves. Very hard. And so realistically, black's only chances of winning are promoting one of these pawns, and there's no way these pawns are getting down the board. So Cayla's best chance of winning is sort of just cutting off the king and marching these pawns down the board and getting another queen. But Joel's still fighting. Very exciting. This is an interesting move. Moving this pawn actually removes the trap, the pen, the cage on the knight, because when the pawn was here, it was guarding the square, and the king guards the square, which are the knight's only two possible outs. But now the knight can get out, which lets one of black's only two pieces back into the game. So not ideal, but not the worst thing in the world. To be perfectly honest, this square is still seen by the bishop, so it's actually not that bad. Cayla's just making some moves. They're a bit pressed for time. The king moves over, attacks the bishop. Cayla moves her pawn up, not realizing that her bishop is hanging. Joel collects the bishop. It's getting intense now. Cayla's down to 20 seconds at this stage in the game, so she is really struggling for time. So she's making quick moves, and the problem with making quick moves is that you miss good moves when you have to make quick moves. Even I miss good moves, even decent moves when I have to move when I'm on serious time pressure. Because if you run out of time, you just lose, no matter how big your advantage is. So now the knight gets out, which we talked about earlier with pushing that pawn. And Cayla starts that process of slowly getting her pawns down the board. And Joel has to figure out some kind of counterplay with just a knight and a bishop. He's got a hope though. There's always a dream. Cayla's trying to pick up this pawn. Joel has rerouted his knight all the way back to his side of the board. Cayla collects the pawn. Joel moves his king to attack the bishop. Cayla moves the bishop away, but actually hangs it to the knight. And Joel sees it and picks it up. Cayla then moves her knight, checking the king. The king moves toward the knight. Cayla's panicking a little bit. And Joel picks up the knight again, and a sequences of tragic blunders. Black is in almost a winning position. He has to just defend this pawn and get it down the edge of the board. The knight can capture the pawn, opening up the path so the pawn can queen. The promotion square is defended by the bishop. But white has all these pawns that she can start running down the board. If she can get one of these pawns to the other side of the board before this pawn can be removed, the knight can be rerouted, and this pawn can make the queen. It's just now we're just in the heat of the moment. And funnily enough, Michael Stockfish evaluates this position as perfectly even. Because material stands one pawn each here. Cayla's up 3 pawns, which is worth the bishop. The bishop's worth 3, and so the 3 pawns equal the bishop, and 2 knights. So in this position, somehow we've arrived at an endgame, a bishop and knight endgame that is exactly even. I don't know how it happened. But the drama is still unfolding. Cayla pushes her pawn, attacking the knight. The knight wanted to move anyway and captures this pawn. Cayla is making a run for it. she's got to queen the pawn. She's only got 18 seconds on her clock. Joel's down to a minute. The bishop infiltrates. Cayla's making a run for it. What's gonna happen? Joel has
a prediction.
Yes.
Black wins.
Okay. Joel still has time on his clock. Joel's managed his time, and he gets the bishop back, attacking the knight and defending the potential promotion square of the pawn, and also defending the promotion square of his pawn. Just an incredible bishop move. This move, getting this bishop over here onto f6, absolutely devastating. Absolutely devastating for the white position. Cayla pushes her pawn anyway. She's committed. And Joel picks up the knight. Cayla's really struggling now. Cayla is trying to find some way to not throw the game away. That was very handily won, while Joel has just slowly navigated to equality and now a slightly winning position, if not a heavily winning position. The fact that this bishop not only defends the promotion square, also blockades this pawn. This pawn can't move forward anymore. It can't capture the bishop, and it can't move forward at all. So the bishop not only blocks this pawn, but guards the promotion square. So Cayla has to start moving this pawn up to try to threaten it away, but she can't move it up directly, because if she moves it up to here, the bishop could theoretically take. The problem is, though, then she would then open up the promotion square and give a check on Joel's king. So this position is still very prickly. Joel moves his knight, checks the king, opens up the pawn to promote himself. I'm telling you, man, now this is exciting chess. You can't tell me that this isn't exciting chess.
I believe you.
With 19,
it seems like Joel has scaled.
Joel has scaled. He's gotten his production up. He's got all the SUVs. He's on a full saturated 4 bases as Terran, and is just pumping out Marines and tanks and Thors, and just closing out the game. And for our league players, a fair comparison would probably be like a 6-item Cassiopeia.
I was gonna go with a 4-item Jax.
Oh, okay, that's a good example too. Cayla pushes her pawn after moving her king. Joel moves his pawn. Cayla moves her pawn. Joel's making that march. Cayla's only 1 square away from promotion, but she can't because it's defended by the bishop, and Joel is slowly going to be promoting it to a queen himself. Cayla has to go for the desperation. She has to attack the bishop and see if Joel fails to find the critical line, which would simply be bringing the bishop to e7. Bishop e7 prevents this pawn from being able to get there in time. This pawn will promote into a queen. The king can't contest the promotion, and it'll be over. What does Joel do in this position? Joel simply moves his pawn one more square forward. And Cayla snaps up the bishop with her pawn. But it's not over because Joel can promote into a queen. Joel not only promotes to a queen, he promotes to a queen with check. And it's a disaster. Cayla has to move the king away. Joel gives another check with the queen. Oh my god, it's so exciting. Cayla has to keep running her king away. Joel has kind of run out of checks for the time being. There's
change my prediction.
What?
White wins.
Okay. We'll see. Joel brings his queen all the way up to the top, adding another defender to the potential promotion square, or now the only defender because the bishop is gone. A critical move in the position for sure. Cayla starts pushing her other pawns. Somehow she's not able to find an attack on the king. This knight move could check the king and start getting him out of the corner. Checkmating with a king and a queen is simple enough, but these pawns all threatening to become queens keeps the position somewhat in balance. And then Joel makes a very interesting move, bringing his king up and blocking the long diagonal of his queen. Very interesting choice. How does Cayla respond? Cayla pushes another pawn. Now she has two pawns, one square away from promotion each, but the entire promotion rank is defended by the queen. She has to find a way to get through. Joel's king is now moving over to start collecting these pawns. It's a disaster. Cayla goes for the promotion with a check on the king. Joel's queen collects the pawn, the queen who became a queen from a pawn. Cayla's got doubled pawns and a king against the queen and a knight.
Like, change my prediction.
Yes.
Black wins.
Cayla is trying desperately to push her pawns. Black finds another check. Cayla has to move her king out of check, trying to defend her pawns as best as she can. The knight moves forward, attacking the pawns. And now...
Does she promote?
She should promote. She doesn't. She moves the king.
Oh, no.
A disaster. And then Joel, another catastrophic mistake, moves the queen to attack the pawn but fails to defend the promotion square. And Cayla's actually able to promote into a queen. And the game is back. Stockfish evaluates this as 0.0. There's no advantage for either side. It's a perfectly even game again with perfect play. Somehow this game has gone from no pieces to now both players having queens again on equal footing.
I think I'd like to change my prediction.
No one can predict this. Not even God. Not even God could predict who wins this game. Joel goes into the tank. Joel goes into the tank and makes a catastrophic move. He moves his knight to check the king, forgetting that pawns take diagonally. He's not even under time pressure. He has 40 seconds on his clock. Cayla's gotten up to 20 seconds on her clock by making quick moves. Cayla captures the knight. The position is still completely even. How does Joel close this position out? If anything, it should be a draw. We all know it can't possibly be a draw.
Never.
Cayla moves her king forward. Joel continues to move his queen around, angling. Pawn comes forward. Joel has to think about it.
He has time.
He has time. He has 40 seconds to think about it. Joel moves his queen. Cayla moves her king. Joel moves his queen back.
A second queen? What?
What could be happening? Cayla moves her king down.
Don't tell me.
Joel moves his queen. Oh, not there. Sorry. Joel moves his queen. And Cayla gets a second queen. Joel moves his queen. What's gonna happen? The queen can just take. Sorry, the queen can just take. King takes back, and Cayla's up a whole queen. What does she do? She goes for this. She finds the check on the king. This should surely be over. 2 connected queens on the back rank. And Joel moves his king down. Cayla continues to give checks. It's truly anyone's guess as to what happens here. Joel is trying desperately to defend. At any point in time, Cayla could just take the queen and go into a completely winning endgame with a king and a queen. And then disaster.
No. No.
Disaster strike.
No. Not like this.
In this position, Michael, what move do you think Cayla makes?
I think she moves her queen to b6.
In this position, Michael, Cayla moves her queen to g7. Hanging the queen with check. Once again, equalizing the game potentially, as long as Joel sees it. And Joel doesn't see it. He moves his queen out of the way. Cayla then finds this check, skewering the king to the queen. My heart is racing. They're both at 30 seconds. Joel moves his king down, offering the exchange. Cayla simply has to take the queen and go into a winning king and queen endgame. But I think her lack of confidence, her lack of concrete understanding of how to structure a mate with a checkmate with a king and a queen holds her back from this. She once again pushes her queen down and hangs her queen a second time. Can Joel recognize it? He's thinking. He's pondering. It almost looks like he's going to take it, but he doesn't. He moves the queen one forward. And now Cayla could take the queen, defended by her other queen, and completely close the game. And she does. She finds the queen capture, checks the king. Her queen is defended by her other queen. Joel is left with only a king. He moves his king down.
Somehow I think Joel's gonna win.
Cayla moves her queen.
Oh, it kind of makes like a silly dragon face. Do you see it?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, I see it.
Joel moves his king down. Cayla simply needs to do a ladder mate, walk him down the side of the board. Cayla moves her queen down. Joel is desperately trying to find anything he can possibly do in this position to stay in it. His only legal move, you can look at the board, his only legal move in the whole game, because you can't move into check, is to move 1 square down. Cayla then moves her queen down. And once again, Joel has 2 legal moves left. What does he do?
Now I'm wondering why she didn't move it down to e4.
Yes. Now the king moves down to d1. And now there's a very simple mate in 2 from here in a number of different sequences. The most simple one would be simply, I believe, queen to f2, I think is winning. I think queen f2, and then the king is trapped because the queen will defend this whole rank, and he can't move this way, right? He can't move into the queen because the queen will be, not only if the queen comes here, does the queen cover this whole rank, but it also covers, obviously, this square as well. So the king's only legal move would then be to go to here. And then this queen can drop down and deliver mate on the back rank. So that's an option. Another option in this position, if I can look for 1 second, I think queen c4 is an option. Because I think after queen c4, king has to go to d2 as the only legal move because the queens control the whole file. So I think if queen c4, king d2, and then queen c to c2, right? Yes. Here, no. Wait. Queen to e4. Hold on. There's a couple other ones here. There's obviously a lot of different ways to make the king. Cayla moves down. It's mate in 1. This is the main line that I was saying. Basically, it's just the king has only one legal move. King d2 is his only option. And after king d2, queen e to e2, this move is mate because defended by the queen. And they cut off this square, this square, this square, this square, and all of these squares and attack the king. So
How much time is left?
25 seconds for Joel, 30 seconds for Cayla.
Okay.
So Cayla has 30 seconds to find the essential queen to e2, well, queen e to e2, because they could both theoretically go to e2. But queen e to e2 is just mate, mate in 1. And what does she do? She does not go to the critical move. She goes here. And although Joel could capture the queen, Joel could capture the queen in this position and put Cayla down to 1 queen and a king. He goes for a desperate maneuver, moving his king down 1 square. And now an enormous number of moves are just made. Queen e to c1 is an option. So like this move is mate, covering this, this, and this. So this is mate. I think e2 is also still mate. I think a4 is mate. Is that right? Queen a4, is that mate? Covering all these and attacking, yeah. So that would also be mate. So any of these, these 3 moves are all mate in 1. And what does Cayla do in this position? The unthinkable. Queen to c3. Stalemate. The king is not in check, but has no legal moves.
No way.
And we have a draw in game 4. Oh my god, what an incredible game.
I didn't think anything would make chess exciting.
It turns out it's possible.
Now, to give the benefit of the doubt, these are very fast turns. You don't have a lot of time to think about it.
Yeah, you don't.
So it's understandable. But what a rush.
What a rush. I couldn't agree more. Oh my god. So I believe the score is now 2 points for Joel, 1.5 points for Cayla. And it's
I don't like that at all.
first to 3, because you get a half a point each for a draw.
So then wouldn't he be at 2.5 points?
Yeah, he's at. Sorry, did I say 2? He's at 2.5
Yeah.
points.
Okay, so if they draw again, Joel wins.
Correct. If
You
they
know,
draw again, Joel will win. Joel wins off of a win or a draw now.
I kind of hope this is like a 30-second game where like somebody just mates in like turn 5.
Like a scholar's mate, like a quick 3-move mate.
Yeah.
I love that. We'll see. Cayla now has the black pieces again. And man, I can't tell you, Michael, like as a chess player myself, like if I was playing a series like this, like coming out of a 147 move game like that last one,
Wait,
in,
what?
into that, yeah, there was 147 moves in that last game. Um, coming
I need to
com-
go see my doctor.
coming out of that right into this next game with no break in between. Ah, man, shaking yourself off from that. I don't know. It's like as Joel, it's like you're like sweating because it's like, man, you were staring down the barrel of being at match point again, like and potentially losing, going from 2-0 up to match point and 2-2, barely clutching out a draw by the skin of your teeth. And then as Cayla, right, you're like, oh my god, how did I blunder a completely one position? And you must be just like, banging your head on the table or something. Um,
Kayla would have to win 2 now?
Cayla is at 1.5, so yeah, she has to win one, and then if she wins one and then draws, they'll both be at 3 points each, and then we'll have to play a tiebreaker.
Tell me that happens.
We'll see. We'll see. Um, so off to the races again. This is now game 5. Um, Joel continue with his standard play of development. He loves going for this Fiend Keto position with this bishop. Um,
I too love keto. I mean,
it's good for therapy, kids.
mm,
Um, Joel's moving his bishop a second time in the opening. Not a huge fan. Oh man, some ideas for black continuing to try to take control of the center with the pawns is always good. Joel is just moving his bishop back and forth. Not really sure what he's planning on doing. Cayla once again gets this big center, which we talked about, the thing you never say to your girlfriend. Um, the
you
knight,
only say it once.
and then you don't have a girlfriend.
Yes.
These knights, man, are they're defending the pawns. They're controlling so much space on the board. These pawns themselves are also controlling squares. I mean, oops. And so already black has 6 squares on white's territory under control. And it's just opened up the diagonals for their bishops. It's just such a good position. This is what's called a big center in chess, and like letting your opponent get this as either side is generally frowned upon in most opening theory, which is why a lot of the time you want to like contest the center as white early on with your first few moves, rather than going for this like sort of weakening fianchetto position. But it's fine. But the problem is Joel, like, first he moved this pawn, then he moved his bishop, then he moved his bishop here, then he moved his bishop back. He's moved his bishop like 3 times, first to here, then back again. Where Cayla has
You think
gotten,
he's just like frazzled from the last game?
yeah, I think that's totally possible. Um, but meanwhile, Cayla is just obviously probably a little frustrated. Is just continuing with standard development ideas, trying to crawl back into this series. Um, she's been doing a great job. Literally, totally different player from those first 2 games, like which were just complete blowouts. Um,
You know, are you familiar with the 2000, I believe, 16 Worlds game where Meteos learned how to play Lee Sin over 56 minutes?
I am vaguely familiar with it.
That is what this reminds me of.
um, Joel really likes putting his bishops on the side of the board. They get some
Like putting a lot of stuff on the side, knights and bishops.
knights and bishops. Yeah, it's true. Um, Cayla calmly captures the knight. I mean the bishop. Trades exchange bishops and gets the knight on the edge of the board. Now she has to think about how she wants to develop these pieces. Contemplating She pushes her pawn. Nice little waiting move so she doesn't spend too much time thinking. Her position is solid enough as is, so she can start making it a bit more prickly. Joel attacks this pawn, but doesn't realize that this knight is just hanging now. We'll see if Cayla sees it. She doesn't see it. Hard to notice that these knights move in very tricky ways. Joel doesn't fail to see it. Nice check on the king. Cayla can recapture with her queen. And here's an interesting instructive moment. Although these innocuous pawn moves seemed relatively harmless, they actually are super, super, super bad long term for your position. Because if you think about the relative strength of squares on your side of the board, I'd like to draw your attention, Michael, to these squares. These 4 squares on black side of the board. By pushing these pawns forward, you create permanent long-term weaknesses for these 4 squares, because no pawn can defend these squares, if you see now, because the only other potential defend, like 1 square at a time, like this square, can only be defended by this pawn. So, I mean, when I say can only be defended by this pawn, I mean the only pawn that can defend the square is this pawn, right? Whereas like the square that this pawn is on could be defended by both of these pawns. So this square is forever weakened because this pawn can't defend it anymore. Now this square, the one the queen is on, right, it can normally be defended by both of these pawns, but because she's committed these pawns forward, now the square that the queen is on also doesn't have any more pawns that can defend it. So again, pushing this pawn forward, although just a solid waiting move, trying to get white to do something or make a mistake, has created long-term problems for black's position. And same thing on this side, like this square normally only defended by this pawn, and this square, black's d pawn has already been traded off.
I hate when that happens to my d pawn.
Black's d pawn has already been traded off, so they don't have the defender on this side, and now that this pawn has pushed forward, there's no longer a defender from this side. So these 4 squares are now what are called target squares. So a solid plan for white in sort of any position that transposes from here is trying to get like, a bishop onto this square and like, really like pin this pawn in and start like looking for infiltration with like their queen, or getting a knight, like getting, where this knight is, where the black knight is, if white can sort of rotate eventually their knight around, you could see how they, through a sequence of moves, hypothetically, if they weren't going to get captured, like here, for example, like sort of in a later game position, this is what's called like, rotating your knight effectively, getting it around to the square where it can't be attacked by pawns. Really strong, particularly if you could push this pawn and also, blockade this pawn and defend the knight. Bit complicated, but those are some of the ideas that I'm looking at already in this position. But we'll see how it goes. Pawns keep getting pushed. One thing I will say is that as the players are warming up, they are starting to play much faster, not thinking so much anymore, which can sometimes be a good thing and sometimes be a bad thing. I do better in most things though when I turn my brain off.
I'd say I'm probably the opposite. I think when my brain is off is when I get into the most trouble.
That's probably the more normal response.
That's when I say things like large center.
Oh, the last few sequences of moves has sort of gotten Cayla into a bit of a pickle. She's hung a few pieces in a row. If we take where we are now and just go back a few moves, we can see that fairly quickly from that position we were talking about after the weakening of these squares, some pawns got pushed. This knight became under attack by this pawn. She ignored it and castled and lost her knight. She then recaptured with the bishop, and then promptly was put under attack again by this pawn, and centralized her rook, which this is like a good idea. You want your rooks to be like on the center files and have them be as open as possible. Sort of developing your rooks to the center is like really strong. That's like sort of the benefit of castling, is that you sort of get your rook off the side of the board and onto the center area, which is good. But the problem is that although yes, you're taking the semi-open file, you are also hanging your bishop, which is exactly what happened. Now, in this position, on move 16, Cayla's in a bit of a pickle. She's down a knight and a bishop that she's hung in sequence over on that right side of the board, and she really needs to come up with something. She has to find some kind of compensation with this kind of a position. So she's going to keep pushing her pawns. She can capture back. Joel gets the open file with his queen, which is really nice. Cayla thinks for a second. She ends up pushing this pawn, attacking the knight. Pretty easy for Joel to recapture. Joel actually brings his queen in with a check on the king, defended by the knight. A clever little tactic. Cayla really does need to just capture the queen and accept the queen trade, which she does. Joel confidently trading queens when he's up material is the sign of a strong player, or at least an above average player. So Cayla has to figure out what to do now. He's going to start chopping up his pawn position, which is pretty good. Disconnecting these pawns is always strong. She can now win that pawn, which is pretty good. This knight's really strong, but it's a little awkward. Joel centralizing his rooks. Cayla finding checks. He can just move out, though, unfortunately. Not quite mate. But Cayla keeps just gobbling up these pawns. So she's definitely clawing her way back. She's definitely found some amount of compensation, but there's pawns hanging everywhere. But she finds this check, and now, unfortunately, this comes with disaster, because the bishop can just recapture the rook now. Bishops can go backwards. Knights, most pieces except pawns can go backwards. We'll see, though, if Joel sees it. He doesn't. He moves his king calmly back in between his little rooks. And then Cayla finds, I think probably unintentionally, but she finds this wonderful little tactic of moving this rook, which pins the bishop to the king. And so now the bishop can't capture the rook because it would be moving her king into check, which is an illegal move. So cute little tactic for sure. Definitely starting to equalize for sure. And then at a certain point, always, if you could potentially defend it, there's this pawn move, which would actually fork the bishop and the knight. The bishop could theoretically just take the pawn if it wasn't defended, but let's say you move the king up one to here, and then at some point can get this move if these pieces don't move. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to immediately move the king because it would be moving into check, but you know what I'm saying. There'd be some potential to like this, and then get this fork off. Hypothetically, it's possible. But we'll see how Joel responds to the pin that I mentioned. He moves his rook, sort of choosing to ignore it, offering the trade. Cayla doesn't want it. Smart to not trade pieces when you're down in material. Cayla has two rooks, and they're very powerful. One of them has infiltrated, which is good. Infiltrating a rook means getting it onto your opponent's side of the board. Joel is sort of just moving pieces. He hangs his bishop with check because the bishop was still pinned. He moves his rook to defend, but then also hangs his other knight. Joel tries to go for a desperate counterattack, which Cayla meets with moving her king, attacks the rook. Cayla can capture the pawn, and now is just gobbling up this position, is now completely winning. Joel goes to the back, trying to attack this pawn. Cayla's trying to get some counterplay, checks the king, another skewer, another great tactic on the king. Can win the rook actually now.
Doesn't she just trade rooks?
She
If
should
she
just
did.
trade. Yeah, she should just trade rooks, but she goes for the check in, which is fine. King moves back, attacking the rook. Gotta be careful here. She moves the rook out of danger, attacking this pawn and offering the trade of pawns. Like if this rook takes, she'll take, which is exactly what happens. Cayla's down to 30 seconds. Joel has a minute and 20. So Joel has plenty of time on the clock as white, but has found himself in a bit of a struggling situation. But interestingly, we have once again arrived in a a king and rook endgame versus king and rook endgame with two rooks. This is one of the more theoretical endgames, and this should most of the time be a draw. But the problem is that Cayla's up 3 pawns, which is just really powerful. Even though these 2 pawns are doubled, which we've already talked about as being bad since they don't defend each other and they get in each other's way. Generally, not how you want your pawns to be set up, but material advantage is material advantage. So Joel is trying to answer that by, trying to attack all these pieces at once. And he's infiltrated this rook to the 7th rank, which is like one of the strongest places the rook can be for white against black. Cayla also infiltrates to the 2nd rank, which is the black equivalent of the 7th rank for white. So both of these rooks are on really powerful squares. Cayla's other rook is threatening to join up on the 2nd rank with the other rook, which is really devastating. We'll see how Joel responds. I think Joel can just calmly gobble up these pawns, though, which he does. Cayla goes for check, and this check is actually mate. Very clean.
Mm-hmm.
The king can't move anymore. And Cayla finds a decisive victory over Joel. Good old Joel in game 5, bringing her to 2.5 points, and Joel to 2.5 points.
Oh
So
my god.
a draw will now put them both at 3 and put them into a tiebreak situation. A win for either player wins the match. Just incredible. After the first 2 games, those super decisive wins, there was just no chance in my mind that I thought we would possibly get a series like this. But here we are. How are you feeling about the series?
I don't know.
Bit of a loss for words.
I know that somebody is going to the Shadow Realm, and I don't know who.
God, I love Yu-Gi-Oh so much. Oh my
Do
god.
it.
Cayla with the white pieces going for a queen's pawn game, and now game 6. Joel, breaking from his norm, launching an attack immediately in the center with his knight. Cayla could calmly just push this pawn forward and attack the knight, really start fucking with Joel's position. She could also obviously develop this knight to defend, which is what she does. A much more measured move. And then Joel reverts back to his tried and true, his fianchetto ideas with his bishop. Cayla calmly continues to develop her pawns in the center, reinforcing her central pawn. Joel moves his pawn. Cayla moves her pawn, going for kind of a delayed London system with these pawns in this sort of pyramid structure. Joel is sort of making a barricade with his pawns, and Cayla goes for this sort of wing knight move, which we've talked about as not being very good. Kids, don't put your knights on the side of the board. Joel puts his knight on the side of the board to try to match Cayla in, some form of camaraderie. Cayla pushes her pawn. After this, Joel finds check on the king here, which is a bit awkward, but there's a few different ways that you can remedy this. You can block with the knight or the bishop and just offer an exchange. We'll see what she does. She chooses to go for the bishop. I think this is the more traditional line because now if the bishop moves away, you will pick up the knight. So you're kind of pinning the bishop to the knight and forcing the bishop to trade, which I think is generally speaking the way to go in this kind of a attack on the king side. So Joel blunders and moves his bishop away and hangs his knight in 1 to the bishop. We'll see if Cayla sees it. She's thinking about it. I'm not sure she sees it. Oh, maybe she does. Aha, she finds it. The hanging knight. once again finds a massive advantage in the game early on. This is not looking
Although
good for Joel.
if we know anything, still anybody's game.
Of course, it's anybody's game until the very last move. Joel moves his pawn, trying to push this bishop out.
Let me tell you, I think the worst possible outcome is a draw.
I tend to agree. Some games that end up in draws are like the one we saw a few games ago was unbelievable, but most top end professional games that end in draws are incredibly boring. So I agree by and large. I think draws.
Oh, I just mean because then there's another game.
True. That's another thing to consider. This
I think
bishop.
that's bad for everybody's mental.
These players have been through so much already. And this was the inaugural game of the Corona Catz Casual Chess Championship. Hard to believe that this match has been the way it's gone. Joel just loves putting his knights on the side of the board like this. Cayla sort of semi-centralizing her rook, which is fine. I would really love to see her develop this bishop and castle, but she could also do the fianchetto and then castle, which would be even stronger potentially. What are Joel's ideas in this position? All his pieces are a bit wonky. He goes for a pawn break. Not sure if he calculated this or not. Probably not. We'll see how it works out for him. Cayla's thinking about it. And she accepts the pawn. We'll see how Joel wants to take back. He'll take back with a pawn of his own. Generally speaking, a good choice. Now we can see pretty quickly that, bishop takes pawn, bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop, and you end up just a pawn up in the exchange. We'll see if they recognize that. Cayla snaps up the pawn. I think she might know. And Joel shies away from the exchange, choosing instead to move his bishop down. Not sure if that's the call. Because now this bishop can simply take the rook. The rook is actually just hanging on the back because he declined to go for the bishop exchange. That's something that actually I notice when Em and I are playing a lot, is that she will shy away from exchanges, which then sort of puts her down a tempo because like she's made a move moving away from just like a fairly even exchange, which then gives me another opportunity to find like another attack on something else. But it is up to Cayla to see it. She doesn't. She, trying to go for some kind of a rook lift potentially. This pawn push comes down, and now she sees it. She can take the hanging rook. Now Cayla is just like in a super winning position. Joel connects his bishops. Cayla comes to collect. Nom nom nom, give me the pawn. Oh, wait. She's thinking about it. She was holding the piece over. She was thinking about it. Maybe she might want to take with the knight instead. Interesting. She takes with the knight instead. I think the pawn take actually comes with the attack on the bishop, which I think is just a little bit better. But we are getting the knight off the side of the board, which is never an issue. Queen centralizes. An interesting idea. This knight comes in with this interesting attack on the king and the rook, but blunders it to the bishop. Cayla has completed her rook lift and is now attacking this bishop. Joel
I dated somebody that had a rook lift.
I don't even want to know what that means.
Probably the best.
With this bishop move, though, there's an interesting tactic. Joel has actually pinned the knight to the rook. So if this knight moves at all, and the rook will fall, which is a sneaky little tactic. She doesn't see it. She moves the knight to the center of the board and hangs it immediately to the queen, but it comes with a trap. Oh no, disaster. What seemed at first like a complete blunder, hanging the knight and one to the queen, Joel too eagerly snaps it up with the queen, failing to realize the sight range of the bishop. Cayla hits him with a really clever trap. Joel, in frustration, captures back with the bishop, and Cayla is up a full queen and a full rook. And
she kind of just said, "No, you."
Literally, she's up a queen and a rook in exchange for a knight and a bishop. So not even. But that's not the game's certainly not over yet. I do think that White's best plan of action here is to just Fianchetto the bishop and go for the castle. But we'll see what happens. Cayla instead tries to attack this bishop. I like that idea, actually. It's undefended. In response, Joel goes back to centralizing his knight. Cayla takes the bishop, says thank you very much. Have a nice day. I'll be taking the championship. Joel goes in with the knight attack, attacking the queen. And then Cayla comes in with the fucking queen. Oh my god. It's mate in 1. King has to only one legal move. King to f8 is the king's only legal move. Followed by
And queen moves up to d8, right?
No, you would lose it to the rook. You'd actually go queen f7, defended by the rook when the king is here, and deliver the kiss of death.
Gotcha.
So basically, king move, queen move. Game's over. She's found the win. Coming back from 0-2 down to getting it all the way up to theoretically match point in a winning position, draws, putting it to a game 5 where a draw would let it win for Joel. She wins, puts them both to 2.5 points each in a do or die win situation for both players, because a draw will put it to another tiebreak. And with a sequence of interesting traps and blunders from Joel, Cayla has found herself in a mate in 1 situation. Joel just simply has to make his only legal move, and Cayla simply has to deliver the finishing blow, the kiss of death. Does she see it?
No.
She's thinking. She picks up her queen and moves it over, and then takes the pawn instead.
The spirit's there.
Playing with her food, potentially. Joel has to be really careful here. Joel takes up the hanging pawn, trying desperately to get anything. It's again mate in 1. And Cayla says, I've got you now. Takes the queen. I'm gonna mate you on the back rank. She did this in game 3, I believe, pretty convincingly. And very confidently slaps this down and says, what are you gonna do about it? And
it wouldn't have been game 3. Game 3 was the draw.
You sure? I think game 4 was the draw. I think Cayla won game 3, and then drew game 4, and it was 2.5 to 1.5, and then she won again after the draw, and then it was 2.5 each, and then now we're in this game.
So I've learned that if I ever say something confidently, I'm wrong.
It's okay. It's okay. You weren't there. You get to relive the excitement with me, and this would 100% be mate in any other situation, except for the fact that Cayla has fallen for the classic blunder where she literally got Joel with it not but a few moves ago. Moving her queen, she fails to see the sight range of the bishop. And in a chaotic turn of events, Joel finds his only legal move in the whole game. Bishop takes queen.
Oh my god.
As someone who was there, the crowd went silent.
I have watched television dramas less dramatic.
She was 1 move away from mate. 1 move. Twice. From winning the match. And she blunders her queen. It's so tragic. So hard to watch. Oh, fuck. Cayla has to strike back, has to do something, has to capture the Hanging Knight. We need to do something. We have to start keeping our wits about ourselves. The match is certainly not over yet. Joel fires back with a check on the king. Cayla has to move up, trapping her bishop in, which is a little awkward. There was a few other moves that could have kept her bishop in play.
I imagine it can be really hard to continue, once you've been stuffed, to continue thinking logically and to keep attempting because you had your expectations just crushed.
Yeah, it's definitely a mentally strenuous activity, to say the least. But Cayla still has chances here. Cayla is still winning. Cayla still has a strong position. She's many pawns up. She can start threatening multiple sides of the board. She's slowly pushing her pawns, trying to improve her position. The rook gobbles up. This rook comes back with check and another disastrous blunder. Cayla, in frustration, is like, just leave the game. I just want checkmate. I just want to win. But again, fails to see the vision line of the bishop.
Not the same bishop.
The same bishop. The revenge of the Sith. When Joel had his queen trapped and blundered by the bishop, White's bishop in the corner, the black bishop said, I will avenge you. And not only has captured the queen, saving mate, but now has also won back the rook and has brought the game into exact parity. One bishop apiece, opposite colors. One rook apiece. And 2 pawns to 4. It is all but an even game, considering that the position of this rook and the position of this bishop are so bad by comparison. This bishop is staring into concrete, can't move anywhere. This rook staring into concrete, can't move anywhere. These are the only moves. The bishop can literally only move here, and the rook can only move here and here. These are the only moves her pieces can make. Meanwhile, black's bishop all the way down. Bam! Black's rook down. Bam! Bam! Has all the central board control in the world. So although white is up 2 pawns, black's position is substantially better, which equalizes the board altogether. And now we get to play a rook and bishop endgame. Ugh, what an incredible state. This kind of an endgame is studied by grandmasters around the world. This is one of the more famous endgames, the rook and bishop. You can arrive at this position quite commonly from a lot of the more modern mainline openings. So this is like the most standard possible endgame that you can get, and it's highly theoretical and filled with a bunch of critical lines. And so we'll see if our players can find any of them either by chance or brilliance. I'm so excited. It's white to move. What is Cayla gonna do? She needs to start activating her pieces. Instead, she's like gonna keep pushing her pawns. Black goes check with the rook. Cayla has to move her king out of check. This rook has infiltrated. He can start gobbling up pawns. Instead, he moves back. Calmly moves back. Cayla comes in with an attack on the rook. Bam. Rook comes over and attack on the bishop. Bam. No you. The reverse Uno card. Cayla's pondering where to move this bishop. She chooses a safe square attacking this pawn, opening up the king side pressure play with her pawns. The rook, still defending it, moves and checks the king. King has to move out of check, unfortunately blocking her bishop again. The bishop's like, God damn it, man, get out of my way. Rook checks the king. King comes in attacking the rook. Very exciting chess that's being played right now. White's king has gotten all the way into the center of the board. Oh, and black finds a devastating tactic. Oh, defended by the bishop. Skewers the king to the bishop. The king has to move down here to stay and defend the bishop. Otherwise, a casual king move left or right will lose the bishop. What does Cayla do? She has to move down and defend her bishop. She doesn't. She moves over. Oh no, it's a disaster. Does Joel pick up the hanging bishop? Please tell me. Not only can he pick up the hanging bishop, but he'll also be moving into check. It's a discovered attack on the king by the bishop and winning the bishop with the rook. Oh, it's a disaster potentially. He doesn't see it. He moves back. He doesn't see it. He does find the discovered attack, but he fails to see the hanging bishop. Joel has 1 minute and 15 seconds on the clock. Cayla has 35 seconds left. Cayla has to move her king. She's fully infiltrating. She's going for the throat. She's like, I am going to mate this king if it's the last thing I do. I couldn't do it with my queen. I couldn't do it with my rook. I'm going to do it myself, says the king. Oh my god. How does Joel defend this? Another check on the king, getting the rook in front of the king, being like, get away from my king. Cayla's like, fine. Nom nom, I'll take the pawn that I wanted. Joel's like, damn it. How do we move forward from here? Joel's down to 1 pawn. Again, I would like to stress that mating with a bishop and a rook against a bishop and a rook is next to impossible. So it'll be really important to either pick up one of these pieces, either the bishop or the rook, with a tactic or something, or trying to get this pawn to promote by attacking this pawn. Because these pawns, the white pawns, are coming, dude. These white pawns have nothing in their way. They're all passed pawns, and they're coming down the board to start making queens. So black has to be really sharp and accurate here to maintain any sort of winning chances at all. Is your heart racing? Because my heart's racing.
I think I've ran out of hype.
You're all out.
At this point, for my own heart, I'd like it to be over.
Joel checks the king, continuing to check the king. Always a safe bet. Cayla moves down and away. Joel finds another check. Cayla moves over, moving out of check. The rook moves back to where it started. The bishop can come in, infiltrating. White's making some forward progress, to be sure. Rook can now pin the bishop to the king. Cayla ignores this entirely and moves the rook to the open file, one of the many open files. How does black respond? Now black's king is getting into the game. Rook comes over to the side, attacking the bishop, even though it's defended by the rook. The bishop moves out of the way. And the rook finds a devastating attack on both the king and the pawn, can pick up the last remaining pawn. Cayla says, no, I'm going for the mate. King moves to attack, and she can pick up the rook. She picks up the rook with a devastating series of tactics. Let's get the instant play-by-play replay. Oh my god, Cayla comes in with the check. The king moves down. She finds the tactic, skewering the king to the rook. The king has to move away, and she picks up the hanging rook. A disaster, and now a completely winning position for white. It is impossible for black to checkmate with the bishop alone. It is insufficient material. Black's only chances of winning are promoting this pawn, and it's staring into granite. And not only that, the bishop can protect this pawn from anything, and if the pawn stays on its current square, this is a dark squared bishop. It can't attack the pawn. White is completely winning now. Cayla just has to march these pawns down the board and promote into a queen. Oh my god, I can't handle it. I actually just can't handle it.
I'm perspirating.
Black goes for another check. Joel continuing to search for these checks, trying to make Cayla make a mistake. Cayla is marching her king down the board, getting it to defend the promotion squares and the march of the pawns, which is coming. Joel's like, I'm going to march my pawn. I'm going to try to make something happen on the other side of the board. Cayla goes for another amazing tactic, pinning the bishop to the king. The bishop can no longer move, because any move the bishop makes with the king on the 7th rank will result in a legal move of moving the king into check. Incredible. How does black respond to this? Black has to get towards the bishop, I suppose. Can't move away. And Cayla, with an uncharacteristic, brilliant play, with the vision to do what it takes. This is a high-level move, Michael. What I'm showing you now is the high-level move. This is not by any means intuitive at all. Cayla sacrifices her rook to win the bishop, because after the king takes back, black has no chance to promote this pawn anymore. This pawn alone cannot beat this pawn, and so the king would have to march all the way down to pick up the pawn. Meanwhile, white's pawns would be free to march up the board. It is now unwinnable. There's no more chances. There's no more chances. You've traded into a completely winning endgame. You get into an opposition state with the enemy king, and you're like, watch as I move this pawn down queen and end the game. But that does require a certain level of competency to be able to actually deliver a checkmate. We'll see if Cayla can clutch the series. Pawn moves. Pawn moves. She's beginning the march of the pawns. Pawn moves. There's no more pawn moves for black. Black's only legal moves are the king now. Cayla moves her next pawn, marching them down. The march of the pawns has begun. Black has to find some kind of a king moves out of opposition. Cayla's like, I'm going for it. This pawn, I can believe. You can be anything you want, your parents told you, and this pawn can certainly become a queen. Oh my god. Joel's king continues to move down, trying to attack the hanging pawns, but it's not. It's defended by the bishop. Cayla continues this steady march to promotion. Joel is trying to get his way down to gobble up this pawn and try to promote a queen of his own, but he's far too late as Cayla makes another move, is one move away from promoting. Joel desperately is running his king. He just can't get there in time, and Cayla promotes into a queen. There's now a queen on the board again. Joel moves down, is threatening to attack the pawn. A very simple queen to g8 defends the pawn, or bishop to f7 also defends the pawn. Either of these two moves completely win the game on the spot for white. Instead, Cayla, in her greed, her lust, pushes her pawn, trying to get another queen, which allows black's king to capture the pawn. Cayla's had none of this. She moves the queen over. The king moves down. She's moving her pawn. The pawns are racing. And then, it's unbelievable. How could this happen? What just happened? It's Cayla's turn. She has to do something. And what does she do, Michael? What in this position does Cayla do? Can she just win the game on the spot? Do you see what she does, Michael?
I don't know, but I'm actually biting my fingernails.
In her lust, her greed, her desire to win, as opposed to checking the king with the queen here and staying in the game by pushing his pawn and cutting off any escape the king could possibly have, somehow Cayla moves her pawn, and the king can't move into his own pawn and can't move into check. It's a stalemate again.
No.
It's a draw. It's a draw again. It can't be possible.
Do you ever have proof that there is no God? Wow.
It's inconceivable. By all rights, Cayla had won the series twice. In spite of missing mate and hanging her queen, she played back in a king and rook and bishop endgame to promote into a queen and find a completely winning position, and ends up drawing the game again. The score now sits 3 points apiece, and we go to sudden death. I simply can't believe it.
You know, I really thought this was going to be a 10-minute thing. Oh, I'm just in as much shock as you are. I've had to poop since game 1.
It's just unbelievable.
It's something.
One can say for sure, though, these are two evenly matched players.
I would call them juggernauts of the arena.
Okay, you gotta tell me, level with me, as a player of video games, as a man of culture.
Mm-hmm. I am both of those things.
Having played in stressful situations, you've played ranked games in League of Legends. You've played ranked
Yeah.
games in World of Warcraft, I'm sure.
Yep.
I think we've played ranked games together in World of Warcraft, actually.
Yeah.
What do you do here? How do you be three? How do you be 3-3 in a best of 5 series? going
Um,
going into game 7.
so I think what you do here is you take a really deep breath, you stand up from the computer. You take like 30 seconds to just convince yourself that you're playing the first game of the day.
Oh, brilliant! That's some top tier advice.
I don't think there's anything else. If you let any of the previous games get in your head, you're doomed.
You do. I just have
First
to.
game of the day.
I just have to say to you and to all the people watching this right now who have made it this far, I hope you've enjoyed this cast. And I have to say that if you aren't even a little bit inspired to play chess after this, I mean nothing, and I mean nothing will ever make you want to play chess. Because
That's good to know.
this is as good as it gets.
Yeah. All I know is that if I was in game 7 of a 5-game series, I'd
Best of 5.
probably kill myself. Doesn't matter what game. So respect to the players for sticking with it.
Truly. And no better way to start off game 7 than the most the most theoretically optimal of all openings for white.
Get your knight on
We've
the side.
got knight to h3 to start the game.
Wow.
Really aggressive and attacking. Cayla responds with pawn to e5, and we're off to the races. Once again, Joel going for his classic fianchetto. He is actually pulling it off this time, and the players are just rapid firing moves right now. Cayla, once again, after this pawn push, gets her big center. Once again, which we like to see. Joel going for an immediate pawn break, however. We'll see if Cayla accepts it. A little bit confused, a little bit frazzled, trying to understand what the best option here is. I believe it is just simply to take, which she does. You could have also theoretically pushed it forward and made the bishop had a hard time. But pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Bishop comes in. Knight gets a nice little rotation around, attacks this bishop. Cayla's knight comes forward and hangs her bishop immediately. Bit of a disaster. Game 7. That's all right. Pushes her pawn, attacks the knight. This game's gotten off real quick. These players just blitzed out their openings. They were ready for each other this time. They had reviewed their prep in the bathroom.
They'd had time to, really become familiar with each other's moves.
Literally, they are the board now. Wax on, wax off. Cayla just very casually hangs her knight, moving it over here to g5.
Wax off.
g5 is completely missed by Joel continuing to put his knights on the edge of the board.
Wax on.
Bishop comes out here, still doesn't realize that this knight is hanging. Joel doesn't care either, moves his knight down.
No, we're not here to take knights, we're here to take kings.
Cayla can take the pawn that was attacking her knight. Joel then attacks the bishop with another pawn. Cayla thinks about it for a few seconds, decides to move her bishop back.
Ooh.
Queen comes in, check on the king, attack on the knight.
Oh my gosh.
A devastating tactic, truly. The knight can hop back and block, though, so it's not completely lost. However, this pawn is hanging. Joel's going for the throat, really coming in here, coming in hot. Hangs his bishop to the queen promptly, and now is also under pressure. This knight is, however, pinned, which is worth noting. How does white respond to this position? We'll see. A very attacking pawn move into the center of the board. This pawn is completely unprotected. The queen could very easily take it. However, Cayla, once again, with her lust and her greed, she goes for the checks on the back rank, not realizing that knights can move backwards. Does Joel see it? Joel sees it, and Cayla has once again hung her queen in game 7. She has a big center. She gets to such a developmental lead in the early stages of the game, and then just blunders it all away. Oh god, I'm sorry, Cayla, if you made it this far. I'm really sorry. It's just crazy. It's just a crazy series. The fact that you guys are still in it is insane.
Respect.
Big respect. Cayla has to bounce back from this and somehow recover.
I think she will.
She's thinking about it.
I think she's shown a lot of
Resilience, to be sure.
determination, resilience, innovation.
Yep, I agree. With this pawn push attacking the knight, Joel finds, again, this crazy tactic, this fork on the king and the rook, taking the pawn, but unfortunately bishops can in fact move backwards and pick up the knight that's attacking. We'll see if Cayla sees it. Oh, Cayla doesn't see it. It misses the fork and the potential saving grace of the position, winning the knight back, and Joel calmly collects his prize and is in a catastrophic advantage for white. White is up a queen and a pawn. Black can no longer castle, and the central pawns are all gone. It's just a disaster, and also this knight is hanging. If she doesn't do anything about that. We'll see, though. What does she do? How does she possibly come back? You know, at this point, obviously, it's like, you're like, holy fuck, holy fuck, holy fuck. If I throw in the whole series, has it all come down to this? After all this time, has it really come down to this? Cayla moves her king up, failing to defend this knight, which will come with check. We'll see if Joel sees it. Joel does not see it. Joel instead goes to elect for this move, which is fair, moving his knight out of the back row, which was under attack by the rook. This knight is still under attack, and now he's checking the king. So there's a lot of stuff going on now. Cayla calmly moves her king towards the knight to attack it. At any point in time, Joel can collect on this rook. Instead, he does a nice disciplined move, moving the pawn to defend the knight. I think Cayla is starting to realize that her knight is under attack. In spite of that, however, she moves her rook to the semi-open file. A reasonable and solid choice, if not for the fact that her knight is hanging. Joel is finally getting his knight out of the edge of the board, which is good. Cayla's continuing with her rook lift plans, bringing her rook up into the center of the board, or actually more so infiltrating than anything. This knight is still hanging, which is worth mentioning. And Joel finally sees it and collects on it with check, which is fairly devastating, to be honest. Cayla moves her king down, running out of options. This game is getting really dire. Joel delivers another check with the king, with the queen. Cayla's king moves up, and now there is in fact mate in one. Queen here defended by the knight. The knight is defended by the pawn, so the king can't take the knight nor the queen. A very solid mate in one idea here. If Joel sees it, we're waiting on the final verdict. He's thinking. He doesn't see it. He moves the knight away. Cayla still gets to play on. It's hard to make any forward progress in this position. She pushes her pawn forward anyway, trying to find something, with an attack on the knight potentially. Joel rotates his knight towards the center of the board. Cayla takes the pawn. Pawn takes pawn, rook takes pawn with check and an attack on the rook. However, unfortunately, this rook is hanging to the bishop, which is gobbled up. And Cayla has found herself out of pieces. She's down to a bishop and a knight against a bishop and a knight to parity, and is down a queen, a knight, and a rook with the same number of pawns, 4 pawns each. So she's down a queen, a knight, and a rook. Joel is plus 17. And again, like I said earlier, getting checkmate with a bishop and a knight is one of the hardest mates in the entire game. It is inconceivable with this number of remaining pieces for white on the board. So it seems as if it's only a matter of time, and before our series comes to an end, Cayla is looking for any desperate opportunities to try to find options on the side of the board. Meanwhile, Joel slowly contemplates the win, making sure he doesn't throw it away, calmly attacking the knight. Cayla comes in, actually finds a check on the king and fork on the rook. A bit of a blunder by Joel.
Is it enough?
Is it enough? It's the beginning of something. Joel moves his king to try to attack the knight. Cayla, can she see this and pick up the rook that she checked? And she does. She finds it. She finds the rook. Slowly starting to equalize, but still has a long way to go. The queen moves over, attacking the bishop. And the bishop thinks about it, comes and gobbles up the pawn, hanging it to the knight in 1. We'll see if Joel sees it. Nope, instead he pushes the pawn, which is actually clever because it actually comes with a discovered attack on the king with check from the bishop. And interestingly, the king can't move back because of the queen and is being attacked by the bishop, obviously, and so is technically getting mated here, if not for this very surreptitious pawn move, which is the only legal move left in the game. So Cayla has to make this pawn move. It's the only legal move left. And now there is mate in 1 in this position with bishop taking. We'll see if Joel finds it. It's all up to this. Can Joel find the mate in 1? He moves the queen up instead with check. Cayla's king, in a last-ditch effort, has to move down to one of the only 2 remaining legal moves. She decides to move down towards the queen, and this pawn move with check on the king, absolutely catastrophic. Cayla has to move the king towards the pawn to prevent the pawn promoting into a queen and delivering mate on the back row. Can Joel find the mate? There's only 1 move in the game that gives checkmate. Do you see it, Michael? It's white to move, and checkmate in 1 move.
You know, it's queen to e8. No.
Queen to e8. The king can get out.
Then I suppose no. Is it knight to b6?
This move?
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure the king can still move out either of these ways.
Then no.
All right, the move is calmly, and Joel finds it, winning the series 4-3 in a best of 5.
You know,
The king is attacked by the rook. Attacked by the knight. Can't move because of the knight to here. Can't move here or here because of the pawn and the queen. Can't move here because of the queen, and is just dead. And that's our series.
In my mind, they're both winners.
They sure are.
I think it takes a lot of determination and resolve and a willingness to carry on.
Truly.
To play 7 games of chess in a row. When you could be doing literally anything else.
Really inspirational commentary for the rest of our 16-man tournament.
Say what?
This was round 1.
It was riveting at parts. I think game 4 might have been the closest I've ever come to caring about chess.
Incredible.
And coming from me, that's really saying something.
Incredible. Like I said earlier, if this series didn't make you want to play chess, if this series didn't get you excited about the rest of the Corona Catz Casual Chess Championship, literally nothing will. Thank you all for tuning in. It's been John and my co-host Michael Oliger bringing you this incredible series between Joel and Cayla. Congratulations again to both of our competitors. And we will see you in the next round. Good night.